I'm Jyothi Robertson. This talk is approved for race credits. So I was told to mention that there's a QR code on the side. And so if you are a veterinarian or who else receives race credits? RVTs, but is there anyone else? No? Okay. Okay, those two. So if you're an RVT or a veterinarian, you do receive credit for this particular talk. So the title of the talk was given to me by best friends, and I think the title is pretty interesting. Navigating opposing visions and goals between veterinarians and leaderships in shelters. Underlying the title itself, there's an assumption. The assumption relates to that word, opposing. The first assumption that I had when I heard this was, okay, first of all, there are opposing visions and goals between vets and leadership. And the second is that that's a problem, right? Because when we hear the word opposing, we think of opposition, conflict. At least in my mind, I have sort of a negative view of what the word opposing is. So there is an underlying assumption that if there are opposing views between veterinarians and shelters, that is a conflict area that needs to be navigated or addressed. So I want you to hold those two assumptions lightly as an inquiry in your mind, because that's what I did when I was preparing for this talk. So let me set the stage about who I am. So I am a shelter veterinarian, and I started working as a vet specifically for shelters in 2005. First for the city of Hayward, and then for the city of Oakland. And I worked as a contract vet, a shelter vet, a lead vet, medical director, and then moved on to operations and so on. Along the way, I did a residency in shelter medicine when it was brand new to do a residency in shelter medicine. So we were still trying to figure out what that actually meant to get a residency in shelter medicine. And I started a consulting firm in 2010 and 2011 called JVR Shelter Strategies, where I began working with vet teams throughout the country, kind of going from state to state and learning about some of the challenges that they have and then working with them on their efficiencies, on their processes, on their protocols, and so on. So that was the beginning of my consultation life. I then moved from that to working with leadership. That means working with whole organizations, working with CEOs one-on-one to have conversations with them about relationships with the vet teams and other processes along the way as well. So it's expanded over time to today when I was asked to give this talk. And underlying all this have been a series of stories and my own assumptions about the relationship between vets and CEOs. So I'm going to start with a story. I have 3 stories, by the way, in this talk, and this is the first of the 3. So it's a bright Sunday afternoon, okay? Really sunny, it's a gorgeous day, it's about noon, and the year is 2007 or 2008. I was trying to figure it out yesterday and I just couldn't, but it's one of those 2 years, I think. And I get a call from the director of the shelter that I work with. And she says, Jyothi, can you come in to the shelter? You know, it's not an emergency, don't worry, but can you please come in because I want to show you something. And, you know, I don't work on Sundays, but the director's, you know, sort of a friend. And I was curious and she's asking me to come. So I went ahead, drove across the bay, got to the city of Oakland and walked in. And this is what I saw. I saw a lot of dogs together in an outside grassy area. Okay, let me place you into the context. It's 2007 and 2008. So in my mind, as a veterinarian who's graduated recently, I start panicking. And I think, oh my goodness, a whole bunch of dogs together, infectious disease, we're going to have a distemper outbreak. Individual animal health. My role as a veterinarian was to protect the individual animal, right? So I'm thinking, okay, an animal can bite each other. All of a sudden, we're going to end up with maybe parvo or distemper. My entire population is going to end up with disease. Our population flow is going to slow down. You know, you could sense the anxiety rising inside of me at that time. Now, my director was thinking in a very different framework. She was thinking, okay, we are in the city of Oakland at a shelter that has all indoor runs. We have transfer doors and the dogs have to stay inside. And the only time they get out is maybe once or twice to be walked. And that these dogs' individual animal mental well-being was at stake. They're starting to spin around. They're getting really stressed out. And we need to be thinking about the staff who are seeing this. Like, what does it look like for our staff to be able to see dogs being dogs and having a great time playing? What about public who comes and now they want to adopt these dogs because they're seeing them playing together? So she was coming at it at a very different angle than I was at that time. Now, the day before, she had invited out Dogs Playing for Life, which at that time, this is before people talked about dog play groups as the norm, right? So that was one form of play groups. But now we talk about many forms of play groups, right? Intentional play groups and getting dogs together. Yet at that time, it was brand new. And she chose not to invite me on that first day because she had a feeling that I would struggle with the concept of it. And so the second day, she invited me, and then I saw it. And so think about, give me a second here. Think about a time when your view might have been challenged by somebody in your organization. You know, how did you navigate that challenge in itself? This happens all of the time. I'm going to continue the same story later on, so you'll hear how we navigated this. But what this sets up is this idea that in my perspective, and from my perspective at this time, veterinarians in leadership did have different roles. And some of it was fluid, but some of it wasn't. Both of us were thinking about managing expectations of the public, of our contracts, of our donors, of our staff. I was more focused on individual animal health from a certain perspective, but from another perspective, she was very focused on individual animal health as well. And both of us were thinking about the population as a whole. So these concepts that I've written up here, the safety, community, euthanasia, and culture, are concepts that I saw as very fluid at the time, and yet I noticed myself that there was some form of assumption and opposition that I was seeing in my workspace. The question was, for this lecture, again, I was invited to talk about this. I wanted to know, am I just presenting my own experience, or am I presenting something that's a little bit broader than just myself? So I wanted to test my assumptions. And the way to do that was to create a study. In this study, my initial question was exactly those first two questions that I mentioned. Is there opposition between vets and leadership? And if there is that a concern? And more importantly, the reason we're talking about this is because we want to understand how to manage successful teams that are happy, veterinarians that want to come to work, CEOs that want to come to work. So what does it look like to lead an effective vet leadership team? The hypothesis I had when coming into this was that vets and leaderships may have conflicting views, but having conflict in itself is not a problem. There's something else, right? The differing goals can still lead to really effective programs. And so what I did was I created a survey with my team, a survey for both veterinarians and executive director CEOs. Initially, I wanted to move into just focusing on CEOs and executive directors. The idea is to broaden to all leadership teams. So let me take you through a little bit of the study that I was working on. Now, remember, I started it because of this talk, which meant I found out about this talk in May, and so I started the survey and pushed it out in June. And the way that I pushed it out is I posted it on some Facebook groups, and I talked about it in the Maddie's Monday calls, the national calls. And that's about it. I emailed a few CEOs as well. And so between June 13th and July 12th, which is when I was initially working on this talk, we got a total of 92 responses. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but when you think about 92 veterinarians and CEOs filling out a survey with absolutely zero incentives and no funding behind it, I was really impressed. I was expecting 4 people, honestly, to do this survey, and that I'd have to come up with some other idea to say in front of you guys, but which I shouldn't have said that. Oh, okay, there you go. I'm going to keep correcting myself throughout this talk. It'll be awesome. And so 92 responses. And through August 6th, which is when I was working on the slides, there's a total of 156, which is awesome. By the end of this talk, I'm going to ask every single one of you, especially Roland, who's walking in late, to get that QR code and to spread this survey to all of his staff and any veterinarians that he has. Excuse me for that side comment there. So the very first question of the survey is the organization you're affiliated with, what type of organization is it, right? Is it a government animal control agency? Does it have a contract? Does it not? And my reason for asking this is because I was thinking, well, maybe if you're a veterinarian who works with an animal control agency, you have a different relationship with your CEO or leadership. Because now you have to take in strays, you have to take in medical cases. So your relationship, perhaps it's better because you feel like you're really helping the community in a meaningful way, or perhaps it's worse because your hands are tied from a budgetary standpoint or some other standpoint. So I really wanted to draw out, which veterinarians are affiliated with one of these types of organizations. And the 3 colors, the yellow, red, and blue that you see here are those shelters that have physical structures. The other ones that are smaller are those shelters, those organizations that don't have a physical structure. So a rescue organization, for example, who answered as well. So it's a pretty nice breakdown, considering, again, we didn't plan this out. The other question I had is, okay, what's the annual intake? And there my thinking was twofold. One, if you're a really small organization, maybe you're working with the CEO, as a veterinarian, you're working with the CEO on a daily basis. And so your relationship is really stellar because you know what the other person really wants and you're working side by side. On the flip side, if you have over 25,000 animals every year, then maybe you never see that CEO or executive director, or that managing director. Or perhaps they have you on leadership already. And so it's a completely different relationship. But I wanted to be able to tease out if the size of the organization impacts the types of teams that people manage and what it looks like to manage a successful team at various sized organizations. And then along those lines, it goes together with operating budget. If you have more than $25 million, does that mean that the veterinarians can basically do whatever type of medicine that they want to do, so they feel like they can do a lot? Or does it make them feel like, we have to take on every single case, and this is really challenging because we have such a large operating budget? Or vice versa, if you have a smaller budget, then are you more aligned with your CEO on which cases you can take in versus those that you can't? And so again, we got a pretty nice distribution for this study. And then the last of the demographic questions that I'm going to show you today is, what is your organization's geographic area? Now, I happen to hold a lot of contracts in the state of Washington and Oregon and California, so that's heavily represented here with the Pacific. If any of you are from the Great Plains, the Mid-Atlantic, or the Northeast, please share this survey with any vets or leadership that you know. I would love to know more about the differences in relationship between those shelters that I've been working with who transport primarily from certain regions of the country to those that maybe are the receiving organizations? Does it change the way that that relationship occurs? So that is the overarching demographic data. We got a really nice split in that first run of the number of people who were vets answering and those that were leadership. Now, I had 2 separate surveys, and what I also teased out is those vets that were on leadership still took the veterinary survey, but they checked off that they're on leadership. So that way I would know that they have a little bit of insight that others don't. And then the 6 veterinarians who are also like animal care directors or executive directors of their organizations also were pulled out completely because they are both people, right? So I was trying to take into account the type of veterinary leadership versus veterinary contractors and so on. So I'm not going to go through every answer for this. I'm only going to do 3, and then I'm going to get into some solutions that came out and tell 2 more stories, because I still have 2 more stories. and this is one of the important questions that I asked, and it's for the veterinarians. I asked, as a veterinarian, what are the key challenges you face when working closely with leadership? And I asked the flip question for leadership. What are the key challenges you face as leadership when working closely with a vet? And I gave in the survey choices that they could select from. Okay, so they had the opportunity to select from a whole series of questions, but they also had the opportunity to fill in other, which, by the way, a lot of folks really did, because they had their own ideas about what it was that was really impacting the challenges. So let's take a look. The primary challenge that vets felt, the one that was answered more than any other question, is that there's differences in priorities or conflicting goals. Well, that's sort of the title of this talk. So that is the primary feeling from the vet side. Yet from the leadership side, only 35% and 33% of leadership felt that integrating vet goals with overall organizational goals or addressing conflicts between veterinary recommendations and organizational priorities were real challenges that they had to face. Okay, so that's the first. The second, for veterinarians, was the lack of effective communication. Communication, key concept here that we're going to talk about a lot more. Shows up as 35% from leadership. Now, you wonder why. Well, it's because most of the communication is coming from, leadership to veterinarians in one direction. But it goes both ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third component for veterinarians was lack of transparency in decision-making processes. I obviously didn't give that selection to the leadership because they are the ones who are making those decisions. And so over 50% of the vets who answered the survey so far believe that these 3 are the top 3 challenges that they face when working with leadership. Now, what are the top 3 on the leadership side? Well, 1 and 2 both speak to culture. The first is managing the veterinary team culture with other departments, and the second is managing expectations and demands, okay, which again speaks to a form of culture. So the third was by balancing financial constraints. So that's where the budget comes into play, right? That's why we wanted to tease out the budget. Balancing financial constraints with the need for quality veterinary care. And that is a real point of strain. This is my dog, Katara, by the way. Some of you have seen her. And almost all these animals are mine. Not all of them. I will point out which ones aren't, but many of them. So we also interviewed a lot of vets. And I've done this over the year to try to get a really solid understanding of how to work with vet teams. And something I hear a lot is that leadership only cares about the numbers, that they care about the adoption numbers, the spay-neuter numbers, the vaccination rate numbers, that they're thinking about how many of these various things are happening. The other component that I hear a lot about is that our medical expertise isn't being regarded as important in decision making. And this comes from a euthanasia standpoint often, where a veterinarian might recommend euthanasia for an animal, and then leadership might actually have some great other avenues to be able to save those animals. So then they're going to go that route. But then the veterinarian feels like their medical expertise was disregarded at that moment, right? So this conflict happens, and yet the animal has benefited from this other view. So that has been the view from the vet side. The two areas that come up often in both my consults and from this survey is that the vet team is in its own silo. That they operate great as a team, but then they don't work well with anybody else because they either think they're better than everybody else because they're doctors or they're techs, they have medical expertise, or that they are so slammed with so much work to get all these animals out that they are so busy internally that they don't have time to communicate externally. And then the other component, and again, this survey is actually quite long. People were writing literally paragraphs. So I could tell that people wanted to talk about this, paragraphs and paragraphs in the answer sections. And what we also heard is that vets are the roadblock to getting more animals out, right? Because they're thinking about the medical aspect, or perhaps they're saying, well, we're concerned about respiratory disease, or we're concerned about disease in some way. So these were the challenges, but let's look at, even in your own organizations. Oh, whoa, sorry. That was exciting. Okay, think about these choices and if any of them really resonate with you. Okay, because all of these are important concepts that help us tease out this relationship and actually work on that, the various aspects of it. Okay, let's do that again. So the flip question from the challenges question is asking, what contributes to a successful working relationship? Right? So now you've told me the challenges. What actually works? You know, what makes sense to you? And there are many different factors. We are really working through the data on this one because, again, imagine pages of responses here. But key words that came out were communication, respect, and trust. Okay, so communication, respect, and trust. Now, when we talk about communication, we talk about it all the time. We say, you know what, we need more communication. We need better communication. We better communicate more with that team or less or different kind of communication. It's good for us to know what we're talking about when we talk about communication. So let me define it for our purposes and actually break it down a little bit more. For our purposes, I'm calling it the sharing of ideas, thoughts, and concerns. So right now, I am sharing ideas with all of you. So that's the purpose here. For what purpose do we communicate? Well, there's many different purposes, but there's a few critical purposes that we have conversations. One of them is to inform. I'm informing you. Another one is to ask a question or to make a declaration. But in shelters, most of the time, it's to coordinate action. I mean, think about all the conversations you have at your shelter or your organization. What is the purpose of all those conversations? A lot of it is to have something happen, right? You're waiting for something to happen. So coordinating action is incredibly important. Now, what mediums are used in our organizations? There's many different mediums, many different sensory mediums, many different forms. There's touch, there's food, there's so many different forms. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to talk about auditory, where speech is a conversation, and I'm going to talk about visual, okay? But mostly speech, because speech is what's really critical for a lot of the communications that have breakdowns. So what's important here for all of us is that we co-create our world through communication and conversation. So every time I come to a conversation with anybody, I have a certain set of thoughts in my mind of what this conversation is going to be about. They have their own set of expectations and ideas about what the conversation is going to be too. We change our view by having that conversation, right? That's the conversational nature of reality. That's the way that we create our organizations, that we create our structures. So if we don't communicate well, then we're in trouble. If we don't inform or have conversations in ways that make sense, then we actually have breakdowns. So for starters, a conversation makes two assumptions, that there is an engaged speaker and there's a committed listener. Right? That's underlying every single conversation. So let's look at this as a story. Now, the title of the story already sort of tells you how my conversation went. The title says breakdown. So obviously it didn't work too well, but let me tell you this story. And I will say that these photos were not taken for the purposes of this story. They just happened to be taken. So it worked out really nicely. So this is a kitten. This is Chloe. She is one of 6 kittens in a litter. And I was consulting with a shelter that was out of town. I was consulting on other matters, and they wanted me to take a look at her. It's the end of the day. It's about 5 p.m. My flight's at 8 p.m., I think, and then I come back on Monday. And so I said, okay, I'll come run over and take a look at her. Her litter mates had already gone home with the foster, but she looked a little lethargic. She had some diarrhea, slight loose stool. She seemed a little dehydrated, and they were concerned about her. So, of course, I started doing an exam. One of the technicians brought her over. We're just taking a look. There's an assistant there as well. And the first thing I do is test for feline Pan-Luc, right? Because I'm thinking dehydrated cat, not doing too great, kitten. We have some diarrhea. It's Pan-Luc negative. That's awesome. I'm really excited about that. The kitten's still dehydrated, so I still want to give fluids. So you can see there's a fluid bag in that photo, by the way. And so I still want to give fluids. And so I turn to Natalia, who's the veterinary assistant. I say, Natalia, now I don't know her very well, but I turn to Natalia and I say, I want to give about 25 cc's sub-Q TID, and can you please inform the foster that this kitten is negative for Pan-Luc, but I'd like to get repeated weights on these kittens to watch for dehydration. Let me know if you see any diarrhea or any signs, and let's put all of that into Pep Point as well. Okay. So I quickly give fluids and I literally run out the door and I'm gone, before anybody can say anything. Well, I come back on Monday because I'm working with them now on a regular basis. So I'm back on Monday and now I go to the computer and I look in Pet Point and there's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there. And so then I go to the cage side and Chloe's still there and I see the fluids and I look at it and Chloe got fluids except only that one time when I gave the fluids. So now I'm thinking, okay, what happened? So I go to Natalia and I say, hey, what's going on? I didn't see anything in Pet Point. She said, oh yeah, I'm getting my Pet Point training today. And so I was thinking, after my Pet Point training, I'd go ahead and I'd put everything into the record. I said, oh, did you get a chance to tell the foster? No, I don't have access to the foster's number because I don't have access to Pet Point. So after the Pet Point training, I was going to go ahead and put everything in and then inform the foster. I said, oh, well, what about the TID fluids? She said, oh, I don't actually know what that meant. I thought you meant today. And I heard you wrong. So TID means 3 times a day, right? But I was just throwing it out there 25 cc's TID. There was a misstep there that happened across the board. And so let's look at what it takes to make a request. And what I'm going to show you on the next slide is a series which should actually apply to any request that you're making, not anywhere that you are. There's always a committed speaker, right? And so in my case, I knew what I wanted to have done. I knew that I wanted fluids to be given. I wanted this record in Pet Point. I knew I wanted the foster called. I needed to be able to articulate what successful completion looked like. Okay, I think I might have done that, but not too great. What I really missed is number 3, the by when. I never told anybody when to do this. In my head, it was all happening right now, because I'm a vet and I'm thinking now. I'm not thinking outside tomorrow or Monday. And then the 4th step is it assumes that the listener is able to complete what's being asked, that they have the set competencies, which means skill set and resources, to be able to complete whatever it is that's being asked. Well, in this case, they did, but only on Monday, right? So as the committed listener, Natalia had to understand what was being asked of her. She has to have the skill set and means to meet the request, which she was going to have, but it was after the fact. She has to agree to the deadline, which of course there was no deadline given, so there was no agreement there. And she has to be able to ask me questions, to counteroffer, to get clarification, right? I can't just run out the door and leave this person, and yet that's what happened. And so thankfully, this kitten actually did really well and was okay. But that could have gone a completely different way. And thankfully, none of the other foster kittens got Pan-Luke. But again, that communication had a breakdown. And so just reflect on any conversation that you've had. And I have to say, this is something that we do most often with those closest to us, like our partners, our friends, where we just assume that they know what we're talking about. My biggest pet peeve happens with this gentleman who's sitting right here. This is my son, Flint, and he leaves the cereal bowl out every single day. And so I need to tell him to put the cereal bowl away, but I need to give him a by when. He can't break his streak, is what he says. But the point is that is exactly what I mean, that even in our families, that there is a committed speaker, and I need to have a committed listener who has a competency to be able to take that cereal bowl and put it away. So that's, side note. So in this study, and I will be sharing these slides, and I can also share I will definitely share the entire study. That'll be published, and not even before published, I'll share it just broadly. We saw that communication was happening frequently, meaning that one of the questions was, how frequently to the veterinarians do you receive updates and information? It was happening daily, weekly, monthly. Well, what's the clarity of that communication? It's all across the board, right? It's all across the board. And how often do you get solicited for feedback? That's all across the board from the vet side. From the leadership side, when asking them, how often do you solicit feedback from vets? It was often, right? 4 and 5 means always, often. But from the vet side, they felt, it's kind of across the board. And so we'll have to wait and see some more of our data to be able to really make conclusions off of that. So what underlies this? Well, co-creators are responsible for conversations that generate action. We just talked about that, how to generate action. And they have to be willing to hold others accountable. So where does that accountability piece fall in? Well, that's the next 2 points. That's trust and respect, which I often group as integrity. But since I have a limited amount of time for this talk, I'm just going to talk about it in terms of trust first. When we talk about trust, like, I trust you as my friend, I trust my son, I trust my spouse, and so on. We throw that word around as it's a static word, that you either have my trust or you don't, right? We break trust and then we're done. It's over. Yet when we think about trust as fluid, what you recognize is that it's in those moments when you're breaking trust that trust is actually built. So trust is fluid, occurring between full self-expression and breaches. Addressing breaches reveals what's missing in order to strengthen trust. So think about that sometime, that like it's when you have that moment of a breach that how you come back together strengthens that trust, respect. So let me go back to story number 1. Back at the dog park. Now, these are my 2 dogs. Some of you have seen this photo before. That's Katara and Pepper. And that's Pepper and Sammy, and you can see that they're sniffing each other. So obviously I got over my, my feelings about putting dogs together in groups. But in that moment, I felt my trust was broken, right, with this director. And so we had to come together and have those conversations. What ended up happening is that we decided that we would vaccinate on intake. Remember, 2007. So we would vaccinate on intake, and then 3 days later, we felt the vaccine in adults was really safe, and we'd go ahead and let those dogs all play together. And that made me feel comfortable back in 2007, and that made Megan feel comfortable too. And yet there are those moments, euthanasia is probably the most critical, where one of you will make a decision that the other may not agree upon. And yet coming back in those moments and being able to have that conversation is really important. Now, trust is rooted underlying culture. So this is the question that I asked: what keeps vets at your organization to leadership? And there are so many words that came out, so we're still working through this, but culture kept coming back. So we have a limited amount of time in this particular lecture to actually go into all the details involving this, but I'm just going to give you 2 points that I talk about with my teams. The first is to observe with intention, and the second is to listen deeply. Ways to build trust and integrity. Well, what does this actually mean? Observing with intention means having a mindset of open curiosity and going in and just listening and seeing what your teams do. So one of the first things I ask a lot of my shelter CEOs to do is to shadow their team as a learner. Now, sometimes this doesn't happen. Sometimes they don't have the time, and it takes about a year later, and now they're shadowing their teams, with intention. But that's when they can see how everybody's working together. In the case of veterinarians, I think that we need to be looking at how prep and post happens when you're doing surgery, when you're working with medicine and other departments. See how adjacent teams impact your vet team. Intake team, adoptions, foster, customer service, all of that feeds into the number of animals you're going to have on any surgical day, the number of vaccine appointments, and so on. So there's a lot there. Time studies and asking clarified questions is really important as well. So in this intention modality, you are a learner. Now, in the listening deeply modality, you are an unlearner. What does that mean? You're noticing your own views and reactivity that are built off of the systems and structures within which we were all raised, within which we are all living and operating within. So we're just noticing who we are and noticing how we show up. The way I do that in my team is I use 2x2s. And are you all familiar already with 2x2s, maybe? Okay, it's similar to 360s. Large organizations, you're going to use 360s so that you get a well-rounded view of how a person is operating. A 2x2, so on this side, I have my strengths. So it says strengths for Jyothi, that's me. Growth areas for Jyothi. Underneath it has strengths for Jasmine. Jasmine works for me. Growth areas for Jasmine. And then I have competency or quality, so like what are my strengths? That's what gets written there. What are my growth areas? And then very specific examples. And then we each do this entire sheet for each other. And then we discuss it. And so now I'm getting a view into how I am being for somebody who works for me and vice versa. And then we co-create our goals together. You can do this more in small teams, but you can done in larger teams as well. And that's just one way. What's important when you're listening deeply is that you design space at the end of your day for grounding and reflection. If you don't have space to think about how you were, what you said, how you felt, it's going to be really hard to be able to unlearn, right? Because that happens in those moments of grounding and stillness. So let me go to my last story. This is a story of change. So again, 2005, I'm working in shelters, and at that time, actually, this is more 2007, especially that photo on the left that I took. That was from 2007. So I'm in my residency at UC Davis. And at this moment, we are recommending that you not touch cats and walk cage to cage because you can, at that point, spread URI. We're also recommending that you should be giving lysine to every single cat because that will help with feline herpes virus. I know Erin just shifted in her seat, so she's very familiar with this. And so this was a different time. By the end of my residency research was on feline URI and on designing portals. And what we determined is that when you increase the size, when you decrease stress, cats are healthier and happier, which means, yes, go ahead and pet your cats. Do this. This is what I was doing. My daughter's doing with the cat, Eloise, that I adopted. And this was us adopting this cat. And we are sitting with that cat. But there was a time where we said, don't even touch those cats if they're sick. You know, we put them in isolation in closed areas because we were afraid of spreading disease. We euthanized cats because of this disease that we were causing because of the stress in our shelters. So I had to come back to the shelters I had worked with and change my recommendations and say, hey, you know what? We've learned newly now. And yes, we said to go ahead and isolate them. And yes, these cats deteriorated. And yes, we ended up euthanizing some of those. And we can do it better. And we can do it differently now. And so change is hard. And just remember that. And remember that for your leaders too, if you're veterinarians, that we can come in there and be like, wow, this is a great scientific study. It shows we need to do this, this, and this, and this. But guess what? That leader has been working for a long time potentially in this industry. And it means confronting situations that they regret and that are really hard and sad to think about, right? Situations where they may have euthanized animals, now we recognize unnecessarily. And so offer a little bit of grace in those conversations and just recognize that that is a difficult place to be. But it's when you're in that challenging conversation that you actually are able to change. Now, I obviously like Gandhi's quote. You know, my grandmother actually grew up with Gandhi in his school, and they taught with him. And he stated, our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. I think we change ourselves and then we change the world, you know? Like we got to do it both, and that's why we're here. So, isn't that cool? I was having so much fun with these transitions, let me tell you. So that's Eloise, who I adopted. In summary, what I feel, and I'll get the actual conclusions when my study is done, but I feel that opposition is really natural. It's a natural occurrence. If we have systems to navigate that opposition when a breach of trust occurs, that's when we're able to build strong teams. That we can create a culture to support those teams through communication and deep listening training. I'm going to show you a couple resources at the end here. That we can design a workplace that supports both being learners and unlearners. So we need to do both. So first, the first thing is that I have this survey, and I really would love it if every single one of you would take the survey and share it with others. By September 30th. There's my by when, okay? By September 30th, please take this survey, share it with your organizations. It will give us a lot more information, and then I can share it back with all of you. And now the other QR code that I want you to take is this one. There is a course that I have on Maddie's University that's a brand new course. It's called The Journey You Own, Practices for Wellbeing and Productivity. There is a section on that that relates to communication and action. You don't have to take the entire course. It's free. You can just pick and choose and jump wherever you want. But in that course, the reason I have that is because it's very introductory, and then we will have a series of conversations, Zoom calls, that will also be recorded. And we want to hear from all of you about what it is you want to do and where your challenges are. There's a couple other resources. The top is Bhavana Learning Group. They're the ones that I did a certification in deep listening training, a multi-year course with them, and they do an excellent job. My professional coach is from there. Brendalyn King is amazing. The Conscious Leadership Group has really great trainings on integrity. So I did not get into the integrity training that I do with teams, but they have fabulous resources. And the last is a book, Conscious Business. If you like to read, it's a really interesting book of how to build value through values. So thank you very much. Thanks for staying through this. If you have questions, please email me. Oh, wait, I'm going to go back. My email's there. Or just ask me after. But thank you.